first type of game is what's called a meeple placement game. A meeple placement game is where you have a game piece or an avatar that you might move around a board or place your avatar around different characters or items on the board. Typically, in this type of game, your goal is to gain resources or currency to use to get closer to your objective. Some popular examples of meeple placement games include Settlers of Catan or Kingdomino. Science and social studies fit really well with the meeple placement type of game. For example, in science, you could move animals around different biomes, or in social studies, you could run a civilization and move your people around to different areas of the board in order to gain resources. The next game type that's very common to board games is what's called a deck game. In a deck game, you might be trying to take tricks on the board by outplaying your opponents. Maybe you're trying to lay down the best collection of cards. Maybe you're actually building a deck of cards that you then continue to play with during the course of the game. Whatever it might be, deck games come in a lot of shapes and sizes. Some popular deck games include Magic the Gathering or Sushi Go. Two great subject areas to use deck games include math and social studies. For example, in math, maybe you're trying to assemble a deck that you can use to play cards to defeat monsters of varying values on the game board. Or maybe in social studies, you're building up your industrial revolution by gathering cards that help build up your assembly. Either way, deck games are all about building the best deck, or taking the most tricks, or laying down the best collection of cards that you can. Games don't have to be just player against player. Some games are called cooperation games, in which all of the players are against the game itself, or maybe the players are on teams against each other. Oftentimes, the objective asks them to complete so many steps or work together to communicate and collaborate before time runs out, or to reach the end of the game before the game stops them. In these types of games, it requires a lot of teamwork and sharing of information. Two popular examples of cooperation games include Pandemic and Forbidden Island. Two subject areas that work really well for cooperation games include science and language arts. In science, students can be working together to take elements and match them together to create compounds before time runs out. Or in language arts, players can be working together to create a collaborative story before the game ends. The next type of game is what's referred to as a creative or party game. A lot of times these games ask you to come up with something original or creative, maybe make something even. Oftentimes the winner is determined maybe by somebody in the game serving as a judge, or maybe guessing something correctly by getting some creative clues. Examples of popular creative games include Pictionary and Apples to Apples. Two great subject areas for this type of game include language arts and science. For example, in language arts, maybe you're trying to create fake news, and you're trying to trick the other players in the game into guessing that your fake news is the real news, while you try to guess the actual real news. In social studies or science, maybe this includes trying to represent a term or an idea by making it out of clay, or drawing it, or using word association with your fellow teammates. One of the first games that you maybe learned how to play as a child was a roll and do game. Roll and do games often come in two specific styles: roll and move, where you roll a dice or use some other apparatus to determine how far to go on the board, or a roll and write, where you roll and then have to use what you rolled on a corresponding sheet or in a certain way to score points. A popular example of the roll and move would be Monopoly. The example of a roll and write would be Yahtzee. Two subject areas that work really well for the roll and do genre include math and language arts. For example, in math, maybe you roll some numbers and symbols and need to use that to get to a specific spot on a game board. Or in language arts, maybe you roll some dice with symbols on it, and you need to use those symbols in order to create and tell an engaging story. The final type of game is what's called combat. In combat, maybe you're trying to eliminate the other players on the board, defeat your fellow players in battle, or take over a certain amount of the game board itself. Some popular examples of the combat genre include the Pokemon trading card game, or Risk. Two subject areas that work really well for the combat genre include social studies and math. Perhaps in math, you are trying to use your tools and resources like cards and power-ups in order to get the exact amount of health you need to eliminate another player. Or in social studies, maybe you are a nation squaring off against other nations in terms of dominating a certain